We've got quite a bit of time, so I was hoping this would be a more or less relaxed chat. I don't have many slides, I don't have any figures to throw at you. I know there's an awful lot of expertise in this room, so I'm as anxious to hear from you as anything else. So by all means, if I say something that doesn't make sense to you, if I say something you disagree with, if you have an insight or a question, please feel free to interrupt me. So I was going to talk to you a little bit today about the ecological emergency. So we're familiar enough with the climate emergency, and sometimes biodiversity gets tacked on to the end of that. So when the Dáil declared a climate emergency back in May, technically it was a climate and biodiversity emergency. In Britain, they declared a climate and an environmental emergency. Greta Thunberg sometimes talks about the climate and ecological emergency. But really, whether you call it biodiversity or ecology, it's really an afterthought. And it doesn't get nearly the amount of attention that the climate crisis gets. So I was going to talk to you a little bit about what it is and why it's important. Now, in case you don't know me, I have been working with the Irish Wildlife Trust for a little bit over 10 years now on these issues. I was the chairman of the IWT from around 2008 to 2012. And it was around that time that a lot of these issues around extinction and ecological degradation really pressed home with me. You know, we learn about these things, they're part of the background noise. The collapse of the Amazon, for instance, didn't start this summer. It's been going on for decades. Overfishing, for instance, some of the problems associated with agricultural intensification have been known for many, many years. I mean, the Irish Wildlife Trust is celebrating 40 years this year. So a lot of these problems are not new. But when I started with the IWT in earnest, it really brought home to me the link between what can be seen as a kind of a scientific problem with the broader issues, particularly around politics and policy. So this is a picture of Ireland that you'll all be familiar with. The photograph, or the image, is an extract from a National Parks and Wildlife Service report about our native woodland. And the caption on the image says that the map shows the distribution of ancient and long-established woodland sites. So these are, you know, we don't know whether there's original woodland left in Ireland, but these are old enough. And as you can see, they're very small and they're very fragmented. And the caption continues: the areas are slightly exaggerated for visual purposes. In other words, they made the dots bigger so we could actually see them. And I suppose the map tells us a lot. And I suppose if we want to start our story, we have to go back quite a long way. We have to go back to, I suppose, a good starting point is when the glaciers started melting in Ireland. So we're familiar with the ice ages. The ice ages came and went for hundreds of thousands of years. We had woolly mammoths, we had hyenas, we had all kinds of things in Ireland. But then the glaciers melted for the last time, and that was around 10,000 years ago. Now, it's commonly believed that humans arrived in Ireland around that time when the glaciers melted. As far as I remember, the oldest definitive evidence of human activity in Ireland is about 9,000 years old, from Mount Sandal, which I think is in County Antrim. But that may not be the full story, and I suppose it's part of the problem with trying to rebuild any kind of picture of the past is there's very little definitive evidence. For instance, there was a scientific paper that came out a couple of years ago from someone I know who works on analysing cave bones from Ireland, and she discovered a knee bone from a brown bear. I think it was from County Clare, and this knee bone had butcher marks on it from around 11,000 years ago. So that in itself is remarkable, but it just asks more questions than it answers, really. I mean, if that's the case, well, then humans have a much longer history in Ireland than we thought. But for most of that human history, you can imagine people arrived here on boats. They would have lived close to the shore. They lived off seafood predominantly, and it's possible to imagine that people rarely ventured very far inland. Now, Ireland at the time, it's commonly believed, was about 80% woodland. That would have been mostly oak forest. Going to Killarney would give you a fair image of what it might have been like. The other 30%, of course, would have been lakes. Ireland was still a wet country. After the glaciers departed, much of the Shannon Basin would have been wet and soggy, and a lot of those places turned into our bogs. And I think from the human story, you could imagine being one of those people living on the north coast of Ireland, and literally they got everything from quite a short radius around where they lived. They were completely entwined with the natural world. They were probably animists. I don't know if there's any evidence of the spiritual beliefs of these people, but it's probably fair enough to believe that they were animist, which means that they saw spirits in the nature around them. They believed that there was an ancestral connection with the trees and with the fish and with the animals in the forest and so on. And everything they ate, everything they hunted, every building material, every ceremony they had, all of that drew on connections with the natural world from quite a small radius around them. And so it stayed the same in Ireland for probably about 4,000 or 5,000 years until the arrival of agriculture. And agriculture in Ireland, as globally, really is at the heart of our current problem today, because it represented a total fracture with that relationship with the natural world. Farming is about controlling nature. It's not about harnessing the very intimate relationships that people had with the natural world. And of course, when farmers arrived, they started to change the landscape. So they started felling the trees, converting forests into farmland. And that's stayed the same for many thousands of years as well. It's interesting how, we had bears in Ireland up until about 3,000 years ago. So it's quite possible to see how, as farms expanded, animals like bears would have been a threat to livestock. And so bands of hunters would have gone out to expressly exterminate the bears from their areas. And so bears went extinct. Because bears are big animals, they have big ranges, and Ireland is not a particularly big place. There wouldn't have been very many bears here to begin with. So it's quite possible to see how that relationship with nature played out in terms of, seeing the good and the bad in nature. We have friends in nature and we have enemies in nature. And big predators, for all of farming history, big predators have been the enemy of nature. Now, I want to introduce you another concept at this point, and that's that of ecological collapse. Now, ecological collapse, I suppose, is something we're hearing more about these days. And it sounds very grim and very apocalyptic, and maybe that's because most of our experience, certainly for me, my experience of ecological collapse is really to do with science fiction, books and films, and I'm thinking in particular the likes of Disney's WALL-E, if you've ever seen that, where the poor little creature runs around trying to keep this little plant alive, and then humans are, morbidly obese, orbiting the Earth, living on technology. Or in Blade Runner, for instance, where the story was how all ecosystems have collapsed and that humans have only managed to survive because of one corporation that has patented survival systems, and we all live in these pretty miserable cities where it rains all the time. And one of the things those films get wrong is that ecological collapse is not the death of everything. The collapse of living ecosystems in the Earth will not result in the death of everything. There is a definition for ecological collapse, and that is a transformation. It is a transformation from one state to another. You could imagine at the times when the first people came to Ireland and we had this dense, deciduous rainforest. That's an extremely stable system. Okay, glaciers and ice sheets would have wiped them out. But we have rainforests in the world today, I'm thinking in particular in Australia and in Southeast Asia, that have been stable for maybe 60 million years, with very little major disturbance to them. So when you go in and you chop down all the trees and you turn it into a farm, that is a collapse of the forest ecosystem, and it changes it into something else. And so that is what ecological collapse is. It's a transformation. Now, you could imagine yourself being an early farmer in Ireland. You were still heavily dependent on nature. You probably had cattle. The dairying system, for instance, in the Cage Fields in Mayo, which goes back many thousands of years, was based on cattle. And you would have still sown oats and vegetables, and you would have got all your water from the local river and everything. So again, that radius that I talked about really hasn't stretched out that much, and the connection with nature was still there. Yes, it was beginning to change into something much more binary between what is friendly nature and what is unfriendly, unwanted nature. But for many thousands of years, we had farming in Ireland. And of course, the forests kind of came and went, as human populations expanded and contracted, the forests kind of moved with them. But certainly for many thousands of years, we had what you might want to call a human farming ecosystem. And that would have been pretty biodiverse compared to what we have today. The fields would have been full of insects and wildflowers, although they were, people would have called them weeds. We would have got an influx of insects and birds in particular from other parts of Europe that do not live in forests. So animals like the barn owl, for instance, the corncrake, the curlew, these are all animals of open grasslands. And so they might have been in our bogs, but certainly the corncrake and the barn owl probably came in with the advance of farming. So that transformation, that collapse of the forest ecosystem into a farming system, it's hard to say that it was all bad. Certainly it was bad for the forest, it was bad for the bears, but it provided opportunities for many other things. And for many thousands of years, that steady state farming more or less continued. Of course, our forests continued to decline and dwindle away. But certainly the narrative that the English took our forests is not correct. The forests started disappearing when the farmers arrived. By the time the English came here in force around, whenever it was, Henry VIII and the sacking of the monasteries, most of our forests were already gone at that stage. And as you can see today, the official figure is about 1.8, 1.9% of Ireland is native woodland. So Ireland today is one of the most deforested countries in the world. We often hear that we're the least forested, and that's also true. But then most of what counts as tree cover in Ireland today they're not native trees, they're kind of industrial plantations. And they're very far removed from the forest ecosystem. Now, something very drastic started happening about 100 years ago today. So you could imagine a farmer around the early 1900s. Again, they probably would have had cattle. This time now we also have sheep and we have goats and we have other things. We have pigs. Ireland would have been full of these small farms, maybe growing oats, maybe growing different things in different years, maybe rotating animals. Beef was something that, if you had a dairy cow, for instance, that provided milk and cheese and so on, and that animal was butchered at the end of her natural life. So beef wasn't the thing that it is today. But then around the post-famine years into the early 20th century, we saw the introduction of two things that really allowed farming to break free from its limits. And they're subsidies and industrial chemicals. So subsidies were introduced after the famine to try and encourage the few remaining farmers that we had, and also to try and make farmland more productive. You could imagine by the end of the 1800s, a lot of our bogs would have been still intact, despite the fact that turf cutting has been a thing in Ireland for, thousands of years. We wouldn't have had any pollution at the end of the 1800s. Pollution was practically unheard of. Every cowpat in the field was saved by a farmer as precious nutrients to go back into vegetable plots. Certainly our rivers more or less ran free. The Shannon, for instance, is very, very windy. And that's the natural way of rivers. Certainly our fishing industry was very, very small scale. And you can read accounts of the fishing industry from Galway, for instance, Galway Bay, the ancient fishing village of the Claddagh, for anyone who's familiar with it, was based on small boats rowing out into Galway Bay and catching herring and halibut and turbot and, you know, a great variety of fish. And those fish sustained a whole community. And, you know, if you compare that today, anyone who's familiar with driving around Galway Bay, it's a rare thing to see a fishing boat. But again, I suppose what I'm getting at here is that the radius of our needs and our wants, even up to the early 20th century, was pretty close to home. All of our food came within a certain radius. All of our building materials came within a certain radius. But when we started subsidizing agriculture and we started using imported chemicals, things started changing very, very dramatically. Number one, it allowed farmers to make a living beyond what nature provided, because government subsidies were going to be there to support them. And also the idea of bringing in industrial chemicals meant that you were now drawing in resources from other parts of the world, particularly fossil fuels, that allowed the expansion of agriculture beyond what the soil could naturally do. So from the famine years, and particularly right through, particularly up to, say, the 1960s, we started seeing the decline in nature in Ireland. And with that decline, we started seeing that radius that I'm talking about starting to expand in proportion to it. So, for instance, overfishing. Overfishing is nothing new. Bottom trawling started in the Middle Ages, but the advance of fossil fuels allowed something like bottom trawling to become much, much more powerful. And you could get bigger boats that could go further out to sea. So all of a sudden, fish populations start disappearing. And we see that particularly around the 1970s, 1980s, when the herring left Ireland in the commercial quantities. When I grew up, we would eat fish on a Friday, and a lot of that fish was whiting, or plaice or cod were really the three common fish, and they would come from Howth. Those fish don't come into Howth anymore in commercial quantities. They tend to be bycatch from a prawn fishing industry, and like most of us don't eat prawns on a Friday. These are destined for restaurants by and large in other countries. So again, that closeness of nature has moved further and further away. So now what we eat today, I mean, it really comes from all over the world. A lot of the fish that we catch today gets mulched up into fish meal that we don't eat directly. We mulch it up into these pellets that go on to feed farmed fish, for instance. And of course, the other thing subsidies did was allow us to what was called reclaim land. And Ireland, of course, has been wet for a very long time. Anybody who's been here for 10 minutes will know that. But in particular, whole swathes of Ireland were waterlogged. It's hard to imagine today the extent of wetlands, for instance, around the Shannon Basin, and the way that the Shannon flooded and meandered. And of course, anyone who studied geography for their junior cert or the inter cert, as I did it, will learn that rivers find their source in the mountains, and when they get to the lowlands, they slow down. And when a river slows down, it starts to meander and make these snaky-like paths. And I remember learning about Oxbow Lakes, this might be familiar to some of you, and how, when that meander gets too big, sometimes the river can take a little shortcut and you get an Oxbow Lake. I mean, I was in my late 30s, I think, before I asked myself the question, why did we learn about Oxbow Lakes? We don't have any. We don't have Oxbow Lakes in Ireland, and the reason we don't have Oxbow Lakes in Ireland anymore is because they've all been drained away. So what we've been doing, and particularly with this is related to subsidies now, because drainage acts have been around since the late 1800s, which involved straightening rivers, deepening them, cutting them off from their floodplains, so that you get more land for agriculture. That was the purpose of drainage in the day. Today we're more concerned about flooding of towns and people's homes, but the Drainage Act that is still the cornerstone of the OPW, for instance, and their drainage works, dates from 1945, and the purpose of the Drainage Act was to create more land for agriculture. And so we get whole river systems like the River Boyne in Meath, for instance, the Clare River in Galway, which were utterly transformed because there was heavy machinery available, there were subsidies applied to it, and these whole river systems were transformed. Of course, around the 1920s, we had a wave of big dam building in Ireland. So we have dams, famously on the River Shannon, the Ardnacrusha Dam. We have 2 dams on the River Lee. We have a dam on the River Erne, on the Liffey. And these are just the big industrial dams I'm talking about. Of course, we have thousands of smaller dams. And they're a problem because a lot of migratory fish then can't get past them. So any fisherman will tell you that salmon numbers today, the salmon, which has been such a part of our cultural heritage over the thousands of years, is on the verge of extinction. Well, it's threatened with extinction. I have to be careful with my language. But in the Shannon, for instance, the Inland Fisheries Ireland, they monitor the numbers, and they count the numbers of fish in order to decide whether that river should be open for sport angling or not. So if they reach a certain threshold, they issue licenses to anglers. If they don't get to the threshold, well, then the river is just completely closed. The proportion of the number of salmon in the upper Shannon beyond Ardnacrusha is about 0.1% of that, what's called that conservation limit. There's practically no salmon left in the Shannon system beyond Ardnacrusha. And the Shannon, of course, we're constantly told is, one of Europe's last great undrained rivers. This is not entirely true because a lot of the tributaries of the Shannon, like the Inny, have been drained. And of course, there's been blasting and all kinds of things to try and make the Shannon navigable. We have weirs and there's all kinds of obstructions on it. So the other thing then is that we've had an application of artificial fertilizer. And about 80% of artificial fertilizer, the PNK that comes out of a bag, about 80% of that ends up in rivers. So we've had not only the physical alteration of our rivers, not only the damming and the blocking of the rivers for migratory fish species, but we also have a chronic pollution problem. And so today, just over half of our rivers and lakes are polluted. And the main culprits for that are agriculture and urban wastewater, so human and animal waste, basically. Now, this came home to me recently. I live in kind of the west part of Dublin, and there was a week there that we didn't have water out of our taps. There was a boil water notice. Now, I'm loath to complain about that because I know there are rural communities in Ireland that have been on boil water notices for years. And of course, one of the advantages of living in Dublin is that politicians will jump up and down about it and the problems will get fixed pretty quickly. The problem with the drinking water notice for us was 2 bugs. There was one called Giardia, the other one was called Cryptosporidium, that was in the water. And these are the products of human and animal waste. And what alarmed me so much as anything else is reading about the commentary in the newspapers about the boil water notice that affected the leak slip treatment plant, was that it was all about how the problem was to do with the filter, the problem was to do with some UV radiation, some piece of technology that the wastewater treatment plant didn't have. I didn't see anybody in the media ask the question, why can't we drink the waters from our rivers? Why is the water from our rivers contaminated with human and animal waste? Now, if you look at the geography of it, the water treatment plant for leak slip is upstream of the city, of course, but upstream of the river at that point. It's mostly the Dublin and Wicklow Mountains. And what's going on in the Dublin and Wicklow Mountains that is causing this pollution? Well, it's a combination of human and animal waste. Of course, our mountains have been degraded and denuded. They were also covered in forest and woodland. That's gone a long time. And particularly in the last decades, we have problems with erosion, with sheep in particular, overgrazing of sheep, fires that have pretty much burnt all of Wicklow at one point or another, even within our national parks. And so all of that pollution is just washing into our rivers. And I suppose this is part of the conversation about ecological collapse that I think is missing. People haven't yet made the connection between nature and all the things that we rely on for our survival. Of course, what has happened over the years from today compared to those first people who arrived in Mount Sandal, we still rely on nature for absolutely everything. Of course, some things are more obvious than others. I mean, all of our food, all of our air, all of our water comes from nature. Of course, an awful lot of the stuff, you look around the room today, all of this stuff is coming out of the ground. It's not just being magicked up from nowhere, and it's being transported from the other side of the world. Now, the reason we're in such a pickle at the moment is because we live in a country today that has collapsed from an ecological point of view. It is utterly transformed. We have no such things as even, remotely natural ecosystems in Ireland. And so nearly everything comes from further away. Our consumption patterns bring in the four corners of the earth. And what we're witnessing now, even in the last 12 months, the fires in the Amazon are risking the total collapse of the Amazon system. That's going to be completely catastrophic for the inhabitants of South America in particular, because most of the hydrological systems in South America rely on the Amazon. It's also going to be catastrophic for everybody on the Earth because of the role the Amazon plays in drawing down carbon. Some of the claims about the oxygen that's being produced by the Amazon were a little exaggerated. I don't think we'll suffocate if the Amazon disappears, but certainly the disappearance of the Amazon is going to be a problem. Of course, we also are looking at the near certain death of coral reefs within the next 10 years. And that's going to be catastrophic for an awful lot of the communities that live near coral reefs and rely on them for fish. Of course, our fish habits have long gone. If you go to a supermarket today, you're very unlikely to find fish that has been caught in Irish waters. You are likely to find salmon, which is farmed, probably in Scotland or Norway, maybe in Ireland. You might find hake. Hake is fished. It's the only fish at the moment that is fished within what are called sustainable limits by the scientists. But everything else is a product of they're either baby fish or we're not supposed to be fishing for them in the first place because the scientists have asked the managers to stop doing it. And of course, we're also witnessing the collapse of the polar ecosystems as well. And the risk now that we are facing is that the collapse of global ecosystems will affect the global population in a way that it has affected us in terms of widening that circle, except the circle can't be widened because we only have one planet. And that will mean the collapse of food systems. It will mean the collapse of water systems. Now, whether the air starts to become unbreathable, I think that is, I'm not sure the science is clear on that. If you look at our ocean ecosystems, 1 in every second breath, in other words, half the oxygen that is generated in the atmosphere comes from the ocean. We know the oceans, of course, are not just being overfished, they're warming, and so we know that warm water holds less oxygen, so they're running out of oxygen. They're chronically polluted, so particularly in places like the Gulf of Mexico, an awful lot of the estuaries around Ireland, Southeast Asia, we have these dead zones or near dead zones, and that is driving jellyfish and algae and so on. And so the oceans are running out of oxygen. They're also acidifying, because one of the things that we've benefited most from the industrial age is that the ocean has absorbed most of the carbon dioxide that we have pumped into it. And of course, it's basic chemistry that carbon dioxide mixed with water turns into carbonic acid. So the oceans are acidifying. And this, of course, has great consequences for an awful lot of ocean life that relies on calcium, available calcium in the water to build their shells. So shellfish, obviously, crustaceans, etc. And of course, the oceans are rising as well. And that's going to have very direct consequences for any of us who live in coastal areas. So I suppose what I'm trying to get across is that the collapse of our living world, the disappearance of the curlew and the corncrake and the angel shark and all these other animals that are disappearing before our eyes actually has very direct consequences. Now, for a lot of us, it's a very painful thing to watch because, you know, we love nature and we've spent a lot of time learning about these animals and plants. And there are many people I work with who give up huge amounts of their time, not because they're worried about global ecosystems, but because they love nature and they like spending time in it, and it pains them terribly to see it disappearing. But of course, for most of us, that is not the case, and you know, you won't read about many of these things in the newspapers or on the telly because we have become so divorced from the natural world around us. So when that circle that I described got wider and wider, so too did our relationship with nature disappear over the horizon. It hasn't gone. The links are still there, of course, but we don't feel it, we don't see it, we don't have that relationship. You imagine the ancients who looked on oak trees and literally saw their relatives when they looked at the oak tree. That's completely gone. We bulldoze trees because they get in the way or because they produce too much leaves. So I guess what I'm saying is our entire relationship with nature has become completely dysfunctional. And not only does the collapse of the living world matter to us in a very physical way, it also matters to us in a very spiritual way. And that is why I think that the solution to our problems doesn't lie in technology, doesn't necessarily lie in policy. Yes, those things come down the line. But fundamentally, at the end of the day, it relies on our ethics and our reaction to nature and the living world. Now, of course, that in itself is complex. We have, for instance, today a farming system that is driving extinction in the countryside, not because farmers get up in the morning and say, I'm going to get that badger today, or to hell with that tree, because their livelihoods are being sucked away from them. And for most of us, that is also a painful thing to watch. Most of us have direct contact with farming communities, and there's still tremendous support for farming in the countryside, but it has to change radically, because it's the same system. It is the same system of globalization, the same system of unlimited economic growth, the belief that export markets and meeting demand for whatever it happens to be, whether it's avocados or beef or, you know, tomatoes in the middle of winter, that demand has to be met, and that demand is more important than a stable living space for humanity. And that's why, of course, the survival of the curlew is important. But this is so interconnected. It connects with our history and our religion, if you have one, or your ethics. It connects with our economy. It connects with our culture and our arts, and pretty much everything. And that's why I believe that a response to it will not be complete unless we can make those connections in a successful way. Now, to me, that is why the UN Sustainable Development Goals, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, is so important. Because when I listen to people on the radio talking about how conifers will help us solve climate change, I'm banging at the radio going, conifers won't help us solve climate change if they're going to continue driving the collapse of our ecosystems and the pollution of our waterways. When I hear people on the radio say, oh, but your demand for beef in China is rising, and if we don't do it, somebody else will, I'm banging on the radio going, but also that demand is driving farmers out of business, and their drive to make a living in an unsustainable way is also connected to our extinction and our water crisis. There are those, of course, who want us to believe that technology will suddenly ride in on a white horse and save the day. We'll spray mirrors into space, or we'll find some genetic code so that we can rear farm animals that don't belch, or some other magic solution is going to come along that won't change our behaviour. And I was reminded on the way in today. I was listening to a BBC documentary about food and the debate about the role of meat in our environmental crisis. And I was listening to one of these tech guys from Impossible Burger or whatever it was called, and I was really, obviously somebody very clever has spotted a gap in a market and set up a company, and are going to make a lot of money out of this. But when you dig into it, you will see the narrative there is that, don't worry folks, you won't have to change your behaviour. You'll be able to continue doing exactly what you're doing, just buy our products. And of course that is a fallacy, because we all know we have to change our behaviour. We have to live within limits. Interestingly, the same programme interviewed a farmer from somewhere in England. And from an environmental point of view, he was an absolute model farmer. He had an area of woodland on his farm. He was producing low intensity livestock that he was using his nutrients very well. Everything was recycled. So he was also growing vegetables, and he had pigs. And it was a beautiful, you can imagine it in your, it's the farm of children's books, really. But he also finished up by saying that he felt that the future required rationing. Almost going back to the warlike state. And he was saying, well, rationing, obviously, if you're a certain age, rationing would probably give bad memories. No one in my generation knows about rationing. But that's not a bad idea. I had always thought of it in terms of, well, meat is going to become very expensive. It's going to be like vinyl when CDs came in, that in 50 years' time, there'll be very few butchers, and you'll be paying a fortune for your steak, and it'll be very delicious and very high-end. But then there is an argument there, that's only something for the rich. But then the alternative is to ration it. And would that really be a bad thing? But there are certainly the ideas that we're going to be needing to be talking about. Now, I do have more than one slide, and I was going to show you just a couple of pictures. I suppose, as I say, I work with the Irish Wildlife Trust. One of my jobs is to try and communicate what we see as the solutions to the problem we're in, trying to take into account that a solution for one thing may cause problems in another. So I am cognizant of the fact that something that we might think is a great idea might be bad for rural communities, for instance, or it might be bad for other things. But anyway, one of my big ideas, and it's not like it's my idea, but is rewilding. You've probably heard about rewilding. I think it's a really exciting term. I think it's exciting for more than one reason. Because even just the word, it imagines that enormous gulf that has opened up between us and the natural world. And I find a lot of people are excited by the word rewilding because it evokes the spirit of, I can get the wild back into my life. Because a lot of us are nature starved, and a lot of us want a more meaningful connection with the world around us. This is a photograph I took from County Mayo a year or so ago. One of those moments with my family where I do a handbrake skid into the side of the road and run half a mile back up the road to take a photograph. And you can see very vividly farming policy in one photograph. Fences are so informative. about what it tells us about the natural world. You can see the farmer on the left here, obviously he's grazing animals, and he's just dug a drain here to dry out the land so we can grow more grass, so we can probably produce more, have more animals on the land. That farmer is doing everything he's been told to do in order to get his single farm payment, upon which he likely relies for a living. He's doing it by the book. This farmer or landowner, whoever it is on the right, I imagine, I don't know, I have no idea what the story is behind it, but that farmer, that landowner is getting nothing. It's getting zero. Even though it is providing habitat for wildlife, it is basically a woodland that is in formation. It's soaking up carbon. It's helping to prevent flooding. And it's doing all these things, but it's getting no recognition within the system. So one of the ideas that we have put forward is to start paying farmers for doing this. And I think that is something that really has to happen. And if it did happen, I think it would be an enormously powerful thing. Here's another fence. This is also in County Mayo. And again, it shows you what happens just when you keep farm animals out. There's a river on the other side of these trees, but you can see what's happened here. Just by keeping the sheep back, you get this lush vegetation. You've got alders and willows and birch trees coming up that is protecting the river. Now, the river is one of the most important salmon rivers in Mayo. And when I turned 180 degrees, this is what I saw. This is where there is no fence, and the sheep are going right up to the edge, and you can see what's happening here. But again, there's no incentive for the farmer to even just cut back a little bit and fence off the river there. Of course, anyone in the west of Ireland or who's been to the west of Ireland will recognise this kind of picture. And for a long time, we've looked at these scrocky-looking trees growing up here. Not really realising that a lot of these places should be forest. They should be forested. Now, they wouldn't all be forested. This particular place is Ballycroy in Mayo, and a lot of it is deep blanket bog, on which trees don't grow. But trees grow in a lot of places where we have assumed they won't grow, and of course they will grow if we were to ease up on the farm animals. This is also in Connemara, and this is one of our ancient and long-established oak woodlands. And of course, it's a magical place. But what we really need to be doing is thinking an awful lot bigger about the size of these places and where they're going to go. And we have to do it in a methodical way. This is Connemara. This is a place called Derry Clare, and it's very near the Connemara National Park, but it's not in the park. It's actually in a Quilcha plantation. And what happened here in front of you was up to 15 years ago a conifer plantation, like a lot of you might be used to seeing. But Quilcha went in and they cut down all the trees, they clear-felled it, and then they did nothing. And 15 years later, this is what we have. Birch and mountain ash. Now the pine trees they're lodgepole pine, not ideal. We'd much prefer if they were Scots pine. But this is what happens when you step back and let nature take over. This is just another slide from the same area. You can see this is quite a wet area. So you can see that even in wetter areas, trees will try to get a foothold. And what you'll end up really is a landscape that is kind of mixed. You'll have bits of forests here and there. You'll have bits of open wetlands and so on. It's not a solid block of anything in particular. But of course, this is what we get a lot of the time. This is pretty much the same area where Quilcha have clear-felled. But here they're replanting with lodgepole pine, I think it is. We have our bogs, the Midlands bogs that have been industrially cut away. They are rewilding all by themselves. Now, with a little help, we could be re-wetting those areas and allowing native woodland to regenerate. But at the moment, the economic blinkers are still on, and there's still a struggle to get the government and agencies like Bord na Móna to see the potential for rewilding and re-wetting all of these places, because really I think it could be wonderful. What you see here is gorse and heather and birch trees naturally coming in, seeding themselves. And of course, we have programs. A lot of people get quite excited about rewilding. They think it's going to drive people off the land and that it's a kind of an anti-farming agenda. But actually, we have programs in government called native woodland schemes that promote the regeneration of scrub woodland. They're just not used very much, but it does kind of show us that it is socially acceptable to talk about these things in a certain context, but maybe not in others. This is a nearby area of woodland. You can see that none of these trees were planted. And again, we know that nature-based solutions are going to be a big part of the required reaction to the climate crisis. But, and of course, politicians love putting on their suits and going out planting trees. But I would always say beware of anyone in a suit planting a tree. It's normally not what you think. And certainly these claims that we're going to plant 100 million trees or whatever number of million trees it is, these all have to be treated with a pinch of salt. Trees are perfectly capable of planting themselves. They've been planting themselves for about 50 million years, long before we came along. And a lot of the time, it's just our sense of uptight control freakery that we feel we have to go out with the spade and the plastic tube and say to the tree, you are going to grow here, and I don't want to hear anything more about it. And of course, a lot of the time, trees don't grow when you do that. So we have to trust in nature a little bit more. This is a hillside from Snowdonia National Park in Wales, and again you can see the fence line is very revealing. You've got sheep on one side, you've no sheep on the other, and you can see the woodland coming back. In my view, and it's probably the most controversial thing I'm going to say today, is that I don't think there should be sheep on the hills in Ireland. I think they should be taken away. I think we should, for farmers in upland areas and hill areas who are able to farm and want to farm, they should be encouraged to use cattle. And high nature value farming should be a part of the solution. But in areas that are not suitable for farm animals, and most of our hills and our bogs are not suitable for farm animals, then we should be paying farmers for rewilding. And we should in many cases be letting the farmers decide what's the land I can farm on, what's the land that isn't really worth it at the moment. This is my last slide. This is a place that I know well. This is my wife, you see in the foreground there. This is Norway, and we go to this place because my father-in-law has a cabin in the forest here. Lucky me, we get to go here every summer, and it's an absolutely stunning place. And when I stand in this vantage point, I'm looking down at the valley, I'm thinking to myself, a lot of Ireland could look like this. A lot of Kerry, a lot of Cork, a lot of Wicklow, a lot of Connemara could look like this. You can see the birch forest. You can see the rocky outcrops, the bog and the river going into the lake. It's a mixed system. And what's interesting about this photograph is this is not a nature reserve. It's not a national park. It's a farm. The farmer owns this land. And in summertime, he has cattle going through the forest, grazing inside the forest. Now, not very many cattle. And in Norway, it snows a lot. So the cattle are not out for a very long time. But the farmer has his animals. He also makes a lot of money from harvesting the birch trees. Birch wood in Norway is what turf is to Ireland. It is their traditional source of fuel. Everyone still likes to burn it. So every year he sells off some of his birch wood. As you can see, it has virtually no impact on the forest. The forest stays intact. And then he also makes money from tourists like ourselves who go and stay there. And he has a son who is anxious to take over this enterprise because it's diverse, because it is profitable. It's not perfect. It's not, from an ecological point of view, Norway is very hostile towards its big predators. It shoots a lot of its wolves and its lynx. There's not much tolerance there for the predators. I'd love to see that change, but certainly it's a whole lot better than what we have in Ireland, and that to me provides hope for us that there are other ways of doing business, and there are solutions out there if we can change our relationship with nature. So thanks very much for listening. I'm happy to take any questions, or if, yeah, go ahead.
Just one question about...
Hang on, wait for the mic, sorry.
Thanks very much for the presentation. It was really engaging and interesting. Listen to that all day. It made me think of one question. What about our bogs here in Ireland, our very degraded bogs? I think we're down to 1% now of the original living bog left. But that does leave a lot of degraded cutaway bogs, and Bord na Móna have threatened to stop peat production by 2028. So is it possible to rewild those sites, and what would be the result, bearing in mind a lot of them are now cut down to the bedrock itself, all the peat is gone? Can they be recreated? They would be formidable carbon sinks. They would contribute an awful lot. Living bog is contributing a lot to climate mitigation. What are your thoughts on rewilding these sites on a big scale?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Bord na Móna are already doing it. I think the figure is 10,000 hectares that they have been working on rewilding and re-wetting. Now, the peat scientists that I know say that the most important thing we should be doing is trying to re-wet. So a lot of this can be turning off the pumps, doing groundworks to change the topography of the land so it holds water rather than having it drain away. It won't be possible to re-wet everything, and then on the drier parts you'll get what I showed you here. So this kind of thing here is basically native woodland generation. So if we were to say, let's rewild, re-wet all of the midland raised bogs, you're talking, I think the figure is 80,000 hectares of Bord na Móna land, which is about there's another 80,000 in private ownership, which we should probably be looking at buying off private landowners to do this. But really the problem at the moment is the mindset. Bord na Móna were set up as a company to provide jobs and basically to make, as a semi-state company, to make money. So, I mean, a lot of people like to bash Bord na Móna, sometimes I'm one of them, but ultimately Bord na Móna will not do what we want it to do unless the politicians step in and change the remit for Bord na Móna. And the same goes for Coillte, by the way. I mean, Coillte would actually be breaking the law were it to do something that lost it money, or lost money for the state. So we can't actually expect it to just turn around and rewild everything. We need the government to say, thanks very much, Coillte, Bord na Móna, for all you've done. Now we want you to do something completely different.
Yeah, I think Bord na Móna is in a different situation now. I think it has to stop extracting peat.
It does, but it doesn't have to stop looking for economic streams. So at the moment, it's applying for wind turbines, it's looking at fish farming, it's looking at what they call herbs, which I think is growing dope on, yeah. You know, so the mindset is there, you know, they say, oh, we love nature, we're naturally driven Bord na Móna. They're not really, they're financially driven. And they'll use the nature for the brochures, but you know, this is not at the centre of their thinking. Yes, sir?
Pádraic, thanks very much for that talk. You've gladdened my heart today because you're speaking my language, and I think some others here, like Paul over there, you're speaking. We're talking about these things all the time, and in fact, 20 odd years ago, I had a group called Nature Ireland, a discussion forum connecting all the NGOs, and I tried to raise that whole conversation about rewilding and connecting everything with wildlife corridors. Didn't go anywhere at the time. So I'm going to have a conversation with you again, because that's the sort of project I'd like to be involved with at this stage. Just to add to what you said there, even locally, if you want to see the benefits of doing nothing, the last recession, you'll have seen in every town around Ireland areas that have been earmarked for development, and nothing happened for 5, 6, 7 years, and suddenly succession was happening. You had your willows, you had your alders, you had gorse, whatever. Biodiversity hotspots locally. Now, unfortunately, we're losing them now because they're all getting built on. But even out of that, the climate change, the hot air programme with Philip Boucher Hayes, they were looking at 2 farming models. So we looked at Lakeview Farm in Cavan, where they moved to extensive sylvan pasture. So they planted native trees with grass, lowered their stocking rates, and suddenly they were actually making the same money as farms twice their size, with much higher stocking rates, and they were sequestering 10 times the amount of carbon, and it left areas go for wildlife, so biodiversity was improving. So the models are already there, active and existing, so it's a no-brainer. They show the best practice chocolate farmer who has to do all the pesticides, everything, high stocking rates, and he actually said he would love to farm in a more empathetic way with nature, just once the subsidies were given. So farmers are open to it from that point of view. It's just IFA and government policy and the EU policy has to change. In terms of major rewilding projects, you're probably familiar with Cairn Farmers Connect and their 200-year plan. That's a great model to use as an example. And recently, there was the Prairies project in Montana in the USA. I actually reached out to the founder of that, and he's willing to have a meeting, but I'm not involved in any active project at the moment, so I've held off on that meeting, so maybe you want a conversation. He's happy to share with somebody over here their experiences, how they went about it, how they funded it. Now, he's quite rich from Silicon Valley, but there's, they did buy land privately and got ownership, but he had to get the community on board, so he's willing to share with us their experiences with that, if you're interested in that.
Very good. Thank you.
Thank you, Pádraic. That was very illuminating. Rewilding is a useful term for people to understand, but we need to also understand that we live in a post-wild world and there's no going back. Every creature and habitat on Earth exists at the whim of humanity, and that's probably going to be the future. I'm planting a field with 1,000 oak trees. It's not rewilding. As you correctly mentioned, this kind of thing, leaving nature to do its own thing, will achieve that. But if we get actively involved, it's basically large-scale gardening from now on. Because we cannot replace or reproduce all the, I suppose, millions of interactions between all the things that make up an oak wood, for example, but nature will do that over time. Our own Paddy Woodworth has written a fantastic book called Once and Future Planet, and he spent 10 years traveling around the world looking at rewilding projects and technically how they did them, the social problems, the financial problems. He looked at reclaiming oak wood in the west of Ireland. He looked at some of the boglands. And for anybody who's involved with this type of process, it's a fantastic project, a fantastic book to look at. I very recommend it. I'd like to talk to you afterwards, possibly about the email I sent you recently on Ballycroy and what one could do with that. There is an organisation called Endangered Landscapes. You can see it endangeredlandscape.org, and there is very serious funding on a European scale for large-scale projects, and we need to start looking at some of these. Thank you.
I'll just respond briefly to that. I think a lot of people are tying themselves up in knots about rewilding in terms of its definition. They want to pin down it means this and it doesn't mean that, or whatever. Rewilding no more has an accepted definition than the word forest has an accepted definition. So I think I think it's okay. I think we're allowed to take from it what we like and leave what we don't like. And somebody mentioned Cairngorms Connects in Scotland. I was there this summer, and I spoke to one of the people involved in the rewilding project. So how did you? There's an enormous valley that they're rewilding with trees, and I asked him, how did you get all the farmers to agree to do this? And he said, there are no farmers. There's just one guy. He lives in Denmark. He owns the whole valley. And we had a cup of tea with him one day, and he thought it was a really nice idea. So, So I get twitchy then at that idea. This guy's a multi-millionaire who decided he wanted to buy a few glens in Scotland, flies in for a couple of weeks every year, and got together with the local conservation group to basically shoot all the deer and put a fence up. I mean, we're not going to learn a huge amount for that in Ireland. That's not a useful template in Ireland. We have to do things very, very differently. So I have no problem with saying there are great ideas within rewilding. Let's take those, let's adapt them to our circumstances and to what will work in Ireland. Go on, yeah.
Hello, thank you for your input. And may I just bring a couple of things to your attention? I would take it that the Wildlife Trust is concerned about endangered species, so perhaps you will take on board to try and do a little more, because the silence of the very multitude of organisations in this context is deafening, which is that when it comes to the badger, you said that the farmer doesn't go out and say, I'm going to get that badger today. He may not, but the Minister of Agriculture has been doing so day in, day out for decades, and there's absolutely nothing being done about it. Now, of course, it's open to everyone, including me, to try and do something, but to be honest with you, I find it too hard to be at the front of that particular campaign, but I do think it's something for the Irish Wildlife Trust. And you mentioned about trees, and you mentioned about there's one other endangered species, perhaps you please bear it more in mind, and that's the endangered species of the sheep farmer, I being one, and working in the environment. And arena, so perhaps you can look out for both of those species as you progress. When it comes to the trees, can you please be very conscious of the 1946 Act? Because I have been an organic farmer, I am not any longer, but the whole approach that you have towards rewilding and biodiversity, as a farmer, I think is wonderful, and I'm delighted to see it happening. I'm not part of any farming organisation, so I'm not speaking for farmers as a group or anything. But what I would try to put to you is to be very conscious of the fact that the 1946 Act means, for me, I will not put a square inch of any of my ground into forestry. Because once I do, it's there for eternity. It's mandatory that I must, and so must all future generations or occupiers of my homestead replant that land in trees. And that obligation is something I will never allow myself to be tied to, and I do not believe other farmers will want to either once to remotely become aware of it. However, I would love to put, and I have some trees, and I would love to do a lot more with them, including in terms of more paddock fencing and integrating them on that kind of structure. But that will never happen once that exists. So as you progress as the body that you are, the Irish Wildlife Trust, I think it's something that is worthy of taking into consideration in a substantial manner. Along with that as you show some of the photographs there that I look at, I see that although you think it is some of it is natural reforestation, what I saw there, I don't believe it is, in fact, some of it. It's in fact blanket machinery cutting of forests, which will actually be detrimental to all wildlife. And because you won't get wildlife in areas where you've taken out forests on a machinery basis as opposed to the historic, more natural ways of doing it. In which case, you then do not get wildlife in this, you just get a blanket forest cover. Sorry. The other thing was just that when you did mention also about things coming down to us being ethical in terms of the earlier stage of your speech, I thought it was well spoken, but you must, if you're going to progress in that line, be very careful who you get, because I think we're in trouble if it's down to ethics. Right? But I thought I should say that much to you, and well done for doing what you're doing.
Well, just on the badgers, I mean, the Irish Wildlife Trust has been campaigning for 30 years on the badgers. I was on the TB forum this year looking at the issue of badgers. So, I mean, certainly we have worked quite a lot on that area. The other thing about the Forestry Act is interesting. You're saying because a lot of farmers don't want to put their land into forestry because then there's no way back. The other problem is that we had a thing called set aside here, you're no doubt familiar with it, whereby farmers were being paid for the kind of thing I'm talking about today, for taking their animals off certain areas. They were basically being paid for natural habitat. But then they reformed it, and then they weren't being paid for it. So all of a sudden, the rug was pulled from under them. And anything that was gained in that period has since been lost. So I think farmers need... There needs to be a long-term thinking, definitely, and also, of course, farmers want options as well. I mean, I think that farmers who have already been doing good things, let's say farmers who already have rich habitats and have held on to them despite everything, they should be first in line for the soup, as it were, when things do change. There has to be, because I do hear some talk of rewarding farmers more for, let's say, converting their dairy farms now into something more eco-friendly. But that means the farmers who've been doing things, the right way all along will end up worse off than the farmers who ploughed on with the mechanisation and everything. So yeah, they have to be worked out.
Go back to the millennium 2000. Every single household in the country was given a tree. Every single household in the country was given a tree. Do any of you know where your trees are? It's a serious question.
Yeah, I do.
Because,
Yeah.
as far as I know, Quilcha control that. So if Quilcha are actually cutting, they're actually cutting your own property.
Well, then the Millennium Forests are still there.
Was it pointed out on the map?
Pardon me?
What are the little spots on the map?
No,
Maps.
I don't know where the Millennium. I don't know where they all are. There's one in Wicklow anyway. Alan.
Thanks very much for a really well delivered and thought-provoking presentation. I'm interested in the 2/3 or so, well, I'm interested in the uplands particularly on a personal level, but 2/3 of Ireland's land area, the primary land use is agriculture. And those of us who have aspirations to see our natural environment better managed so that it provides greater resilience to climate change, we need to figure out how we bring the people who own and manage that land with us. And one of the ways of doing it is through policy changes. So my first question is, what policy change do we need to enable better management of our greatest resource, our land? And the second question then is, are you engaged in dialogue with farmers, and do you have any positive examples that you can share with us of farmers who are, like the example that Justin mentioned from Cavan, farmers who are farming with nature? Because I come from a farming background myself, and much as I might say to farmers, I'm not going to change their ways, farmers are influenced by other farmers. And so if we can discover the good examples out there and share and celebrate those, then maybe we can help the shift that's necessary.
Very good points. On the policy front, the Common Agricultural Policy is absolutely central to all of this. And the next 2 years, I would say, are going to be absolutely crucial to what the next 20 are going to look like. One of the things that, basically, I'll tell you in a nutshell, our vision for land use in this country is a combination of rewilding and high nature value farming. Now those terms are, they're kind of catch-all terms for a lot of things. So, native woodland, for instance, and wetland regeneration. And this wouldn't just be in the farming realm, but could be relevant, let's say, to people who own turbary rights on particular areas. So, paying farmers for the environmental services that they provide. And the other thing then is high nature value farming. And within that there are kind of different strands like organic farming, like regenerative farming, like agroforestry, and all these different things that suit different areas. So those kind of things have to be rewarded as well. And this comes down to, I think the debate at the moment is about whether you pay the farmers for, based on the amount they produce, along with another stream based on environmental services, versus whether you pay them for outcomes. So at the moment, we have environmental schemes and we pay farmers for doing environmentally friendly things, but the problem is that those things are not necessarily doing any good. They're not necessarily addressing the problems we have. So that So really we need to go to results-based, and we need to be recognising that land use is about more than food production. You asked about engagement with farming organisations and individual farmers. And I have to admit, this is something we have to be doing an awful lot more of. I have tried contacting some of the big organisations, and to be honest, it hasn't worked out. I did meet the Irish Natura and Hill Farmers Association once, and we had a perfectly polite and civil conversation. I contacted them again, particularly about rewilding, because I do worry that, you know, the wrong end of the stick is you know, the people are getting the wrong end of the stick. So, but then they didn't reply to my emails. And certainly over the years we have tried with the Irish Farmers Association a number of times. And to be honest, the impression I get is that they don't really want to talk to us. So, you know, below that, below the big organisations, we know that there are lots of individual farmers who are doing exciting things. I have met many of them. I've had many conversations with them. There's one group at the moment called I have been to visit one of the farms down in County Waterford, and we're doing an event next year to try and, because absolutely, I think there's a lot of frustration in the public that there isn't more dialogue going on between farming organisations and environmentalists. But you have to, and you can see even this weekend, the politicians are happy to exploit the perception that farmers and environmentalists are at loggerheads. Leah Varadkar came out yesterday to say that, guys, the farmer bashing has to stop and the farmer shaming. Now, to me, we're not doing any farmer bashing or farmer shaming, and it's Fine Gael policies that are driving farmers out of business. But of course, it suits the politicians to say that, oh, you know, the farmers and environmentalists are in the ring beating the head off each other, and it's our job to kind of keep them apart, when that's actually not what's happening. And I think it also suits the big farmer organisations who are benefiting from the system at the moment. So there's an awful lot wrong, but and I'm not saying there's more. I mean, just to give you an idea of the imbalance, the Irish Farmers Association runs on €10 million a year. The Irish Wildlife Trust runs on €100,000 a year. They're the kind of imbalances that we're faced with. So it is a power imbalance. It's not like environmentalists are at an equal footing with the agricultural industry. I was at a meeting in Cork on Monday to do with overfishing, and there was myself and there was a representative from Birdwatch. And there were 30 other people either in the room or on video links representing the fishing industry and all the agencies of state that are lined up to support the fishing industry. So there was a massive power imbalance there as well.
I can just add a few examples that I've come across for farmers and farmer groups. You mentioned Regenerative Farming Ireland, I believe they're called, on Facebook, which is a really interesting group to follow if you're interested in what's going on or asking questions about it. Tallaght Beal was mentioned up here as well. I've also come across the Bride Project, or the Breed Project in Cork, in that area. And Farming for Nature as well is a great one that looks to showcase farmers who are working in this kind of way. A lot of the time I feel it seems to be individual farmers or collective groups of farmers kind of trying to make the stand for this kind of farming. I kind of feel that, you know, if we can all support each other, then, as you said, farmers listen to other farmers, so they can help provide that push on the larger farming organisations that might stand in their way. So that's just my thoughts on that.
Thanks. When you were talking about the Cairngorms and you were saying that there was one owner for that whole area, we've come across the opposite problem. We're trying to make a biodiversity lane along the stretch that we thought was publicly owned laneway. And when we looked into it, we discovered it was it was actually part of 19 different portfolios, owned by 13 different people. And some of the people, nobody knows who they are even anymore, you know. So it's really hard, I don't know what your solutions might be, to sort of build wildlife corridors across areas of land when you can't even make those connections across lots of different landowners.
Yeah, I agree, and I've been to many commonage areas in Ireland, and you know, trying to say, well, what should be done about commonage areas? Sometimes some of them are owned by 3 people, some of them are owned by 200 people, and sometimes some of the people who own it aren't in the country or might be dead, or, you know, Lord knows, and half the farmers are not talking to the other half, and it can be very complicated. I suppose from our point of view, we're trying to give farmers options. So let's say our groups, community groups, for instance, options that you know, these are there. Obviously, you know, in your situation, it's difficult. I imagine it's just going to take a lot of communication and persuasion to get everybody on board.
Okay, so there's been a lot of hands up, so I just want to make sure I have this correct. We have someone over here. We have two, 3. Or was it? Oh God, he was 4. 4. Will it stop? So it's 5. I'll go with that first. So we have 1 over here.
Just to make a point on, you talk about policy and rewilding, but it's not a case of, as so long as the big chemical companies have your politicians and lobbyists and are involved in our universities and shocks, that it's not going to happen. We have to realize it's not in their interest for rewilding to happen. It's not in their interest for lower input farming to happen. So that's not spoken about enough. It's glossed over. And I'm not hearing it anymore. But I'm coming out of a 55-acre farm myself, which in terms of sanctuary for wildlife, and I'm not hearing anyone talk about that. Just what's your why is it not spoken about? Why is it not talked about?
Well, I think it is.
That includes the IFA as well.
It's spoken about in the circles. I make sense, but I think that is pointing not only to the problems in farming. It is that's a crisis in our whole democracy. That, you know, the capture of politicians by lobbyists is pervasive everywhere. And I've heard it from some politicians I know, even, you know, who work in Brussels and stuff. So if you have enough money, you can camp outside politicians' doorsteps. And that's a problem across, whether it's, you know, pharmaceuticals or the fossil fuel industry or any kinds of things. And how there has been discussion about how do we, you know, obviously we don't want to ditch our democracy. I have heard people talk seriously about some kind of a benign dictatorship that will come in and, you know, just ignore the lobbyists. I wouldn't be in favour of that. That would scare the pants off me. So how are we going to address the crisis in democracy? And I think one of the answers, or at least one of the interesting ideas I've encountered, is the citizens' assemblies that we're looking at to address particular problems. That can be a way for getting politicians over that lobbying hump. But definitely we need some way of getting around it.
But it's not just our politicians, it's our universities, it's our research staff, it's our scientists, it's not just politicians. That's what I'm trying to do. So it's you have to look at it at a deeper level.
It's money, yeah. I mean, you could America is a very extreme example of that, isn't it? You know, I mean, the money has just bought up absolutely everything. And look at the crisis of democracy they have at the moment, and in Britain as well. So there's a much bigger picture there, yeah.
I'm actually just following up on what Catherine said about farmers and the subsidies. There's just a group, I'm sure you're aware of Burn Bio.
Oh yeah.
So they have slight subsidies for farmers where they work with farmers, and it's the farmers that decide what's needed in their land. So they look at what's not working, what is working. I don't know lots about it, I'm sure you know more than I do, just again for other people's information. And they work with farmers to decide what is needed for their land personally, but they get incentives, I suppose a scale of 1 to 10, in a way to try and build biodiversity and better their land. So that's something that they've been trying to roll out already. And then there's another charity that not many people know about. They've been a land trust for over a decade. They're called Greensod Ireland. And they're a lovely, lovely small charity, but again, they're not really funded. They rely on volunteers. But as I said, they've been working for over a decade to try and keep wild acres wild. I just wanted to...
Yeah, I think the point about the burren is that a lot of the technical kind of conservation problems have been solved. We know what they are. I mean, the question there is the burren. And the farming industry loves the burren, because they'll put the pictures on the front of the brochure. But the question is then, why has that stayed in the burren? Why has that not?
Well, it actually hasn't now. It's going to come out a little bit, but it was set up by guys based in the...
Yeah, Brendan Dunford. Yeah. It's made it to the Aran Islands, and. But, I mean, at the time when the success of the burren became apparent, the Heritage Council produced reports for applying that to the whole of the Iveragh Peninsula in Kerry and Connemara. And those reports were pushed aside, and there's been no progress on it. And really then you have to, and I've put this to, I remember putting it to Joe Healy actually in the IFA about, why is the burren not used as a template for everywhere? I mean, Teagasc themselves did a study that showed that about a third of the farmland in Ireland would be suitable for burren type schemes, high nature value farming. But it has gone nowhere. So you have to ask, why is it going nowhere? Why is the resistance? And you have to then come back to the point that this gentleman was making behind you about the lobbyists don't want it. There obviously isn't the money in it. It doesn't create the exports. It'll eliminate the market for pesticides and inputs and big tractors and all of this stuff. It doesn't suit their goals.
Hi, and thanks for your lovely presentation. One of the slides that particularly struck me was the one of the river edge that had been fenced off and had created this lovely kind of natural corridor. I suppose where I'm coming from is the whole idea of catchment management. It struck me that there may be a strand of a solution there that could tie various things together if edges of streams and rivers were fenced and allowed to become rewilded with really very little effort other than just the actual fencing. It would create a kind of a landscape corridor network. It would also improve the water quality in the rivers themselves hugely, and it could have all kinds of positive benefits for natural tourism. And there is an example that can be looked at, which is what Rory Harrington has been doing for many years now in the Anne River in Waterford. It's hugely successful and has seemed to have been kind of adopted by local farmers because they can see it's happening. They're kind of buying into it. And it occurred to me that something like that could be maybe started with kind of a few pilot projects in different areas, and could be something could then take on a life of its own and kind of grow incrementally, and might be just a good place to start.
Yeah, and that, what you just talked about kind of ties in with what you were talking about insofar as the solutions are there. I remember going to a talk by Rory Harrington about his Anne Valley wetlands over 10 years ago, and how successful they were, and how cheap they are, and how they're good for wildlife and good for everything else. Why have they not been rolled out across the country? Why, like every farm should have a wetland or something like that to help to capture sediment and pollutants and so on. So absolutely the solutions are there. The other thing I was going to say is that if we were to imagine what Ireland is going to look like in 100 years' time, and let's say all going well, if we take the right decisions, I think we could have a country where we've got about 30 to 40% of native woodland, or let's say wild areas, that take in the uplands, the worked out midlands, bogs, and river corridors, so that everything is kind of networked together. And then in between you have the high nature value farms, and you have cities and towns, of course, which need a good dollop of greening as well while we're at it. And I think that wouldn't affect food production. Nobody's going to starve to death if we were to do that. We'd still have vibrant farming communities in rural areas producing various high-quality products, not just beef. I'm thinking of things like fruit trees, honey, other types of livestock and so on. So again, I think one of the things that's been missing from our debate overall is that if we can get this right at this very crucial juncture, the future looks quite appealing, I think. Certainly a lot brighter than what it does today.
Do you know what's happened to the Cap for Nature project, or ideas?
The Cap for Nature project?
I think it came from Trinity's looking at the reformation.
Oh, yes, no. Well, it was a website, wasn't it, that they launched? Yeah. As far as I know, it's not precisely a project. It is a website where they're going to put science-based information on it. I mean, I know the scientists behind that. One of them in particular has been working on this high nature value farming. And I'm sure the poor man has little of his own hair left, because he's dedicated his career to thinking that, if I produce the science, if I produce the evidence, then, naturally people will act on it. That's not how things work. And I suppose a lot in the scientific community are feeling that now, that their life's work on the assumption that people would listen to their rational voices just isn't happening, because of what you were saying about the power of the lobbyists at the end.
I think that when I was born, there were about a quarter of the number of people living in the world that there are now. And the population is growing at 1.5% a year. And therefore, they're in the wild. There are frockins, for example, at the moment. You mentioned fruit. But whatever wilding is taking place, there needs to be encouragement for food producing trees and plants to grow, so that if there was a time when there was even more shortage of food, there would be food in the wilds for people to gather if they have the energy to get it.
Well, there's an idea, and maybe I'm not the right person to talk about it, but there's an idea called food sovereignty. I mean, you'll hear the food industry talking about how Ireland feeds 80 million people. Actually, if we were stranded on an island and had to eat all the food we produce, we'd get, the range of food would be very limited. So, we do have to bring... I suppose it goes back to the idea I was talking about that circle, that radius upon which we depend. We have to start bringing that in again, and bringing it in a bit closer. And I suppose that ties in with then, the whole system of global trade and the economic system that we've been founded on. That has to go as well.
Maybe there's 180 million need to be fed products.
Thank you very much for the talk. Just to mention some of those slides, my recollection is that they would have come about through the REPS program, and that insisted that farmers set the fence off back from all waterways, etc., so as to prevent one, it allowed natural development. Secondly, was to keep stock from polluting waterways. But the other area then beyond the fence, in some cases there was set aside where land was left to do its own thing. But the modern version of that is the GLASS program. And I know you've mentioned already, but that's why I'm interested in why Wildlife Trust isn't interacting or are allowed to interact with CHAVIS, the Farming Advisory Group, because that would be beneficial. I have an example of that in some snags that have arisen in their program. For instance, the wild bird cover, where you grow oats and linseed, etc., purely to feed the wild birds. But because of the grain, then that attracts a lot of vermin, and farmers have then had to put down poisons to kill the vermin, and the wild birds in turn pick up the carcasses which kills them because of the containing the poison. So sometimes there's snookers, but the interaction between ourselves and those bodies would be great, but very beneficial. Thank you.
Now, just to say, the Irish Wildlife Trust has had no part to play in Gloss. That was decided on between the Department of Agriculture and the farming organisations. And I mean, the example you gave is indicative, I suppose, of a lot of the problems with Gloss. There's another scheme of heaps of sand in the yard for bees. And like the scientists, put their hand up at the time and said, why would you do that? There's no evidence whatsoever that bees benefit from heaps of sand in the yard. But they did it anyway. And so this is very undermining for everybody. The farmers know it's useless. They're going out putting a heap of sand in the yard and they're getting the money for it. So they don't see the point in why they're doing it. There's another one for putting up bird boxes. And sure, there's a famous photograph doing the rounds of someone who cut down the hedgerow and planted a line of bird boxes where the trees used to be. And that farmer gets paid. So big. And the damaging thing about that is that I think it's very disempowering for farmers who know their land and who are familiar with the wildlife and who know, let's say, that's a great bit of wetland down there. But the inspector who comes along just wants to see the bird boxes. And so the farmer's knowledge, the farmer's intimate knowledge of the land is worthless in this scheme. So that's part of the problem as well.
Pádraic, you've painted a great vision for the future. We were talking about maybe 50-60% of native forest cover, high value nature farming areas, and then the catchment wildlife corridors. To maybe close this session, what would you say? And you said some of the mechanisms that are required, but as individuals and groups walking away today, give us 3 actions that we can start doing to make that vision become a reality.
Well, I mean, the most important thing, and I say this to everyone, I mean, the most important thing we can do is get political. We are in an absolutely crucial cycle now. The next 2 years, we're going to have an election here that's going to set the agenda for, the next 5 years. We have a major climate meeting now next year. We have another major biodiversity meeting next year. We have the new European Parliament and the new CAP coming along. The kind of changes that we're going to need to see will only come about through political pressure. And Irish Wildlife Trust is not a political organisation, but what we do say is if you want green policies, you've got to vote for the politicians who have them, which isn't Fine Gael. But I'm not political.
That's the idea of, I know we're just at time to close it off, so I quite like the idea of that you self brought up there, of if anyone has any ideas of what we can do as community groups to act on rewilding. And I know you said get political, and that I would add to that, that includes, lobbying politicians about these things. I'd also like to go back to one of the points made earlier about engaging with farmers, and I know there's a few farmers and farming backgrounds in the room, so it's not like you're not here. But there are others who want to be in that conversation and to know what's going on. So, to have kind of events around that topic might be something really useful that you could start in your community as a local action. And so does anyone else have any ideas of an action that you could do as a group?
Can I just add, before I let you go, being political is about much more than voting. And as someone who has been watching conservation initiatives over the last 10, 15 years, and the ones that have failed and the ones that have succeeded, one of the great things about Ireland is that our politicians are relatively close to the people and the communities, and they're very, very responsive to community action. And if I was to list the really positive conservation wins over the last 10, 20 years, most of them are not because of NGOs like the IWT. They're about the ban on fracking. I'm thinking of the ban on the big salmon fish farm in Galway Bay, and these were all led by community actions. The Save Leitrim people who are campaigning against conifer forestry, they've been a complete game changer in the whole view of the forestry system. So communities should not underestimate their collective political power, in between elections.
Okay, I'm going to take 3 if we can try to keep them nice and concise. We have one here.
So I'm in the Kildare SPC and we have an IFA lobbyist in the room. So when you put motions forward, for example, on the use of Monsanto products, the IFA lobbyist said through the chair, we have another Monsanto product coming. Can we wait till that one's launched? So for governance of the PPMs and the IEMs, who is in the room lobbying? Who elected the IFA president or other industry bodies? And then be aware of that voice that's in the room.
I don't know if there's a question but an answer.
Who elected that IFA president? How long has that IFA president been in your SPC? Or other industry bodies?
Yeah, such a question, Matt.
Yeah. Stop.
Right. To some degree, I have some inkling into that. I was on the board of a leader company, and the IFA was one of the bodies stemming from the pillars, the social pillars. The IFA automatically had a representative on the board of the local development company. So the same as businesses also had a representative. So it's those requirements for board makeup, they are fluid. The boards can actually decide not to have an IFA member if they vote to. So anybody who's on a board could actually suggest that we vote the IFA off of these boards.
I don't know if anyone saw the press release yesterday from the Department of Agriculture. They announced their stakeholder group for the food, whatever it is, Food Miracle 2030 plan, whatever it is. And I mean, it was, I'd say half of the people there were from the food and drinks industry and the big agriculture and the fishing industry. There was no representative from the IEN. Now I'm trying to get clarity on why that is. There was the head of the EPA and Brendan Dunford from the Burren Bio project were the only 2 people I could see on a list of 30 that had any kind of environmental angle or expertise.
Okay, so we have 2 more from our helpers for today. So firstly,
just to alert people in terms of your interest in climate action and indeed any environmental thing, the government is proposing a new piece of legislation which is going to radically curtail your ability to challenge bad decisions that they make. It's the most fundamental issue that is facing us in terms of protecting the environment. It will compromise individuals, civil society, NGOs. It is breathtakingly draconian. It has dragged the worst practices from all over the EU and glued them together in just an appalling piece of legislation. And if you went out with one thing to do today that is actually going to make a difference for the environment and for climate action, it is to get on to your TDs, particularly Fianna Fáil, who are supporting the Fine Gael government at the moment, and tell them that if they pass this, they need never darken your doors again. It's absolutely critical. It's a housing planning and development bill 2019. The heads of it have been published and it's going through pre-legislative scrutiny, so it will go before a joint Oireachtas committee, and then basically they're going to draft the bill, but it's very detailed as it stands, even at the head stage. And then they're planning to rush that through before Easter, before they go to the polls. It has got to be stopped, and it's got to be stopped quickly before it gets any oxygen.
I'll get the information off you and I'll send it out to everyone who left an email address. Oh, apparently Chase has a petition about it as well at the moment. If you could send that on, that'd be great if you have a link to it. So we just have one final question, and then we're going to just take 2 minutes to let all that sink in and stretch our legs, and then we'll come back here for a slightly shorter, I think we have about 45 minutes to finish off the day.
Yeah, just
following on from that last point, actually, I think there's a real push to quash citizens, and this decision, this possible law is incredible. I think you said about the common agricultural policy, it's happening now, elections are happening now. As an activist for the last 20 years, I'm kind of feeling pretty devastated about it, obviously. But I felt the power with Extinction Rebellion and non-violent civil disobedience, and I just wonder what would be your take on that? Because it's personally, I see it's the only way. What do you think of that being a opposition to this?
Oh, it's been an absolutely essential part. I mean, it's looking for hope, areas for hope is hard, but definitely the school strikes and the Extinction Rebellion have given me cause for hope, because when you see the numbers on the streets and the way that they can capture attention, I think it's absolutely critical. I mean, people shouldn't underestimate the challenge that lies ahead. Absolutely everything has to be turned on its head, everything. And it's not going to turn out well if we sit back nicely and, just hope someone else is going to sort it out, or hope that one of the tech guys in San Francisco is going to come up with a solution. We're going to have to put our boots on the streets and going to make it clear to politicians, like what Attractive was talking about, that if they're going to go down this road, they're not going to get our votes.
Brilliant.